Mhm.
Welcome to Tony at 12. I'm Tony LeBlanc, and today I'm in conversation with Dr. Oren Margolis, a scholar of the Renaissance based at the University of East Anglia. Our subject today is the Blood Libel, where Jews were accused of murdering young children for their blood in the cause of rituals. We'll also go on to talk about Oren's project with the University of East Anglia in connection with the Jewish Cultural Studies project. Oren, good to see you.
Good to see you too, Tony.
Um, Inevitably, the first part of this interview is going to be about anti-Semitism, and I don't think a lot of people probably realise how far back it goes because doing a little bit of research, I discovered it was there in the 3rd century BC.
Well, it really depends on what we're talking about. I mean, we can look at a long history of anti-Jewish persecution. Certainly, the story of the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah is based in that period when Jewish rituals were banned in Jerusalem and so on, and the restoration of these uh, was a cause for a Jewish celebration. But anti-Semitism has taken many different forms over time, and some of the ones that are with us today are probably a little distant from that.
Mm, mm. I mean, I suppose the average Gentile would probably say, "Oh, it's all to do with the crucifixion of Christ, and uh, persecution starts there, abetted by the Romans." But of course, Jesus was a Jew.
At the same, I mean, Jesus, of course, was a Jew, but you know, the issue of Jesus and the issue of the relationship of Judaism to Christianity, and this is something I want to a point I would like to make for your listeners, is an issue of much greater importance to Christians than to Jews.
Yeah.
Um, the thinking about Judaism and what Judaism represents is obviously a concern for Christians because Christianity understands itself as coming out of that. Obviously, Judaism doesn't understand itself that way. But the fact is that in any meaningful sense, and I'm a historian here, I'm not a theologian. In any meaningful sense, Judaism as we have it and Christianity as we have it are products of the exact same time, right? Judaism today does not have a temple in Jerusalem. There's not sacrifices. That world that Jesus of Nazareth knew uh, hasn't existed for 2,000 years. So Jews and Christians have both been developing their religions and their cultures alongside each other over the last 2,000 years, and in complicated ways. It's just important, I think, that we don't tell the story of anti-Semitism as one where the first victim of it is Jesus of Nazareth.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, because it's the old story, isn't it? We sort of look at life and history and everything else. Everyone needs an enemy, whether you be the state or an individual or whatever. It's a horrible thing to have to say, but it's the truth. And of course, there's no doubt about it. As Christianity advanced, there was growing antagonism from the Christian point of view against Jewish people.
In different ways, too. I mean, Judaism in some ways represents a problem for Christianity. One that's, because if Christianity, if the message of Christ is the realization of the prophecies of the Hebrew Bible and so on, what are the Jews still doing today? In some ways, that problem is solved by Saul of Tarsus, St. Paul, by preaching to the Gentiles. But that only kind of expands. In some ways, that also expands the field where the Jews are, a particular issue, something that needs to be explained and solved. Certainly, some of the early church councils and into the early Middle Ages propound various, we might call anti-Semitic policies and certainly some anti-Jewish doctrines. But that point that you made earlier about needing enemies. I mean, even if we don't kind of try to take it as a kind of general point like that,
Mm.
it's worth understanding the ways in which anti-Semitism, both anti-Judaism and then anti-Semitism, so opposition to the Jewish religion, but then also anti-Jewish persecution, are part of the forming of Christian communities.
Yeah.
About making those communities in opposition to others. Sometimes making those communities in across social lines versus another group.
In terms of the promised land, at what point did the Jews have to quit the promised land and move on?
Well, I mean, that's itself a very interesting term. I mean, the idea that the land is promised to the Israelites is obviously comes from the Hebrew Bible, from the 5 books of Moses.
Yeah.
Which, again, being a historian here rather than a rabbi, are as textual scholarship would tell us, are written well after the Israelites are in the land. The temple in Jerusalem is destroyed in 70 AD during the Jewish wars, the so-called Jewish wars of Rome. And we have a remarkable monument to that in Rome itself, in the Arch of Titus, the triumphal arch of Titus, son of Vespasian, future emperor himself, where the spoils of the temple are depicted in procession, including the menorah. So we have a contemporary depiction of the seven-armed candelabra. And also coins are issued then, many coins. Anyone who goes to kind of a great coin cabinet in, say, the British Museum or so on, will find the coins of Judea Capta, captured Judea, with depicting a lamenting woman beneath a palm tree. But Jews do not leave Judea at that point. Jerusalem, the temple is destroyed. It's in the 2nd century, in the Bar Kokhba revolt against Hadrian, that Jews are forbidden from settling in Jerusalem. But again, Jewish communities persist in the in historic Judea and Galilee they persist. The so-called Jerusalem Talmud in the 5th century is the product of rabbis working in the Galilee. And while Jewish population centers definitely spread throughout the Mediterranean and into elsewhere in Europe and North Africa and also Mesopotamia and so on, there's no time at which there is no Jewish settlement whatsoever in Judea or the Galilee.
What made the population go on the move then? What was it impossible for them to stay in the area that was known as Judea, or were they just sort of entrepreneurs that wanted to move into other countries?
Well, Jerusalem itself, which is renamed after the Emperor Hadrian during the Bar Kokhba revolts, becomes forbidden for Jews to live in. But the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Rabbinic Council, had already moved after the destruction of Jerusalem already. The destruction of the temple already. That's a body that persists into the Byzantine period. So I mean, it's worth. So what are some of the reasons? It's worth thinking about the world in which Jews in those early centuries of the Common Era are inhabiting. First of all, the lack of the temple, but secondly, they're operating within the Roman world, and there are Jews on the move through the Roman world. There's Jewish communities in Rome by the time that St. Paul is there. Josephus, the historian of the Jewish antiquities, moves to Rome. He's kind of in the train of the Emperor Vespasian. Jewish communities already before the Common Era had settled in Alexandria. One has to really understand the Jews as an ethnic and religious group but that's operating within this Mediterranean world that, of course, at a certain point becomes half Islamic,
Yeah.
and that's also the context for an important part of Jewish history if we think of that world. The idea, though, that that connection between Jews and the land, well, it remains extremely important on a spiritual and ideological level. But the idea of redemption and the rebuilding of the temple are often, I think the right word is to think of them in an eschatological way. So the rabbis start to think of it in terms of the end of days. And so while Jews are operating within this mixed world.
So we that conveniently takes us up really to the time of the Crusades, doesn't it? And once again, this was Christianity attacking, well, I suppose Muslims and Jews at that time. Yes.
Well, just about to the time of the Crusades, because I think what's really key to our story, key to the story that we'll get on to tell about what we're doing at the University of East Anglia and in Norwich, but also key to the Jewish story, is that period around the year 1000 on either side, both in two ways. The development of that really rich community, by rich I mean also intellectually productive community in Spain, the origins of Sephardic Jewry, but then that center that we recognize in some sense, but I want to get more on the radar, which is the importance of Northwestern Europe as well to this. I mean, every Jewish Bible, a study Bible, will have in parallel or in columns alongside it the commentary of Rashi, the 11th century commentator from northern France. That's also an intellectual center in those generations right before the outbreak of the Crusades. And that's the center from which the Jewish populations that following the Norman conquest come to England. And this is before, this is kind of the preamble to the story of Eastern European Jewry in one way. And it's that connection we're very interested in. In between, of course, we have what you said, which is the Crusades and their impact on Jewish communities of Europe.
Yeah, and that impact was quite considerable, presumably, was it?
It was. The First Crusade is preached by Urban II at Clermont in 1095. The Crusade, as many of your listeners will know, is preached to free the Holy Land, the holy places from Muslim rule. So that is in effect Jerusalem. But obviously the beginnings of the Crusade are preached looking to the Levant. But already by 1096, the so-called Peasants' Crusade in the Rhineland and northern France is being directed against the Jews, and with widespread violence in some of those centers that I was talking about earlier, the Rhineland, France, by local communities, egged on by Peter the Hermit, a charismatic preacher, and that kind of gets back to something that I was talking about. Because if the Crusades are, in one respect, and this is something that many scholars have talked about, a way of kind of creating a sense of Christendom and a Christian knighthood that's not just at its people at each other's throats, but that are about the organization of Christendom under the leadership of the Roman papacy, about directing energies outwards and so on. It's that kind of making of Christendom is also a way of kind of delineating who belongs and who doesn't belong. And that's actually something in which knights and peasants, in that sense, do belong to together against Jews, because Jews are not permitted to, by law, to integrate into their local communities. They play an important function, and they live alongside Christian communities, but they are not part of the community, and they live under Jewish law, often in direct relationship with the monarch. or whichever sovereign authority is there. So what you said earlier about enemies, I kind of resisted thinking about it in terms of just some general point about human nature. We're thinking about the making of Christendom, that's versus, say, the Muslim overseas. That's also about the Jew at home.
Right. Let's move on then to the main topic, which is the blood libel, and this was all about William of Norwich. And the Jews were accused of ritual sacrifices to obtain children's blood, and they had a deal with the devil. Total rubbish, of course. But
well, I mean, quite. William of Norwich. I always say William of Norwich, whoever the so-called William of Norwich, whoever he is. I mean, because if indeed there was a William of, there was a boy who was killed. Around 1144, the historical fact. I mean, the historical fact is the blood libel, right? We don't. The historical question would never be about a killing, and at any rate, the historical fact is the blood libel that develops afterwards in the writings of Geoffrey of Monmouth, and is circulated and spreads and sets kind of a model. And so, I mean, for your listeners, the general gist of it is that the body of a boy is found dead. The Jews are accused of having, in this case, having crucified him in a ritualistic manner, as part of their rituals. And this is a legend that then kind of takes on many elements of story in there to kind of flesh out this narrative, and becomes a powerful model. I mean, in the local context, it's worth noting that these are the type of things that tend to be supported by churches in the locality, as is the case in Norwich, and in this case, towards the creation of a local saints cult, and that seems to be the model elsewhere. Elements of the story continue to develop. I mean, not in the sense of William of Norwich, but other kind of post-William ones. Usually, one of the common elements added to the story is that the blood of the children is used specifically in the rituals, and perhaps in the making of ritual foods like the wine and the matzah on Passover. So Passover often becomes a locus for this. But in the William of Norwich blood libel doesn't make that specific accusation. It does it in some ways seems to take more from the Christ killer accusation, which is different than the blood libel, very different than the blood libel, but this seems to kind of owe something to that.
But of course, people in those days were perhaps not particularly intelligent. I don't wish to sound patronizing, but I think that was a fact. They were basically illiterate. They liked a lot of superstition. And, I mentioned this question of ducking witches. If somebody in the village was deemed to be a witch, she would be ducked. If she stayed under and drowned, that was okay. She obviously wasn't a witch. And if she whizzed back up, she was a witch and got executed. Crazy times.
I would never. Well, look, I would never say, and I don't think anyone who studies the brain would ever say, that people from a long time ago were less intelligent than we are. And that's what makes all of this fascinating. They definitely had different. I mean, what they do have is a different way of making sense of the world, different different knowledge, different and so on. What you say about illiteracy is an interesting point. It's true for much of the population, obviously not true for those in the church, and less true probably within Jewish communities where literacy was more important. But also, a lot of people would have considered themselves illiterate if they didn't read Latin. So the idea of what counts as illiteracy is probably different than ours. But I mean, I think that's what makes it interesting. People are not any more intelligent now. Cognitively, we are exactly the same. And so so when we see things that don't make sense to us in the past, and this is, as a historian, I'm very interested in mentalities. Even, when we see something that doesn't make sense to us, that's where we have to start trying to understand it and start to understand their culture and society. And so some of those things that I was mentioning earlier about making of communities and so on really has to come to the fore, including and then also these anti-Jewish beliefs and preaching. I mean, these stories are being told to kind of be told and turn people against, the Jews among them. And we have to ask, and that's where we kind of are trying to understand why. That comes back to some of these things, what does Judaism represent to Christianity? But also, why are Jews a target within their communities? These people who are both useful, who are, but are also vulnerable. And that is the state of Jews in Europe over a long history.
Well, when we look at history, I believe it was in the 13th century, they were banished from England. Where did they go?
Yeah, the Jewish population through the 13th century of England is facing a lot of persecution after the William of Norwich Blood Libel. But that's not the only. Hugh of Lincoln, Little Hugh of Lincoln, the effectively pogroms that break out in 1190 to coincide with Richard the First Crusade, including a massacre in Norwich, which is kind of part of this story about where the Jews go. But the Jews are expelled from England in 1290 by the order of Edward I. Where Jews go is a very interesting question, and the evidence that we've had recently in Norwich provides some of the answer. There was recently discovered and analyzed some bodies in a well that were clearly Jewish bodies from the 1190 massacre, and there's a genetic match has been found between those bodies and contemporary Ashkenazic Jewish populations. Now, that's not to say that those were Ashkenazic Jews, but rather that Ashkenazic Jews, the Jews of Eastern Europe, originate in, at least in part, in Northwestern Europe. So to the answer to your question of where Jews go, they leave England and they're shortly thereafter expelled from France and evidently must mix with the Rhineland Jews. They certainly adopt a Germanic language, Yiddish, and ultimately those are, the people that were in England are the ancestors of the Jews of Eastern Europe. The Jews who, of course, emigrate from Eastern Europe in large numbers in the early 20th century, including to places like Britain. So, so in that way, our story is kind of coming full circle. But it's so easy to think of a country like Britain or and so on as a country of immigration. But I think this question that you've asked really encapsulates the way of how it may be, but it was first a land of expulsion.
They were blamed for the bubonic plague, the Black Death. I mean, some of these things, Oren, when you look at them, are absolutely impossible in terms of trying to find somebody to kick all the time. And I think from that point of view, it's quite shameful. But 1656.
But of course not. I mean, in England, can I just say? I mean, in England, of course, Jews are expelled by the arrival of the plague. What's significant, though, is that Jews are not necessary for anti-Semitism. The presence of Jews and the presence of anti-Semitic ideas do not require the presence of Jews. I mean, there's anti-Semitic tales in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, and if Chaucer had met a Jewish person, it would have been in Italy, not in England. I say that because today, what we think of as anti-Semitic ideas, including the idea of a kind of a shadowy group of people who live among us, but control things, or the fact that the idea that things don't work for the average person because it's effectively a conspiracy rather than anything structural, is itself anti-Semitic in origin, and doesn't it ever require a Jewish person.
But you mentioned Chaucer, but both Shakespeare and Dickens continue with this outline of a person that's evil. Think of Shylock in The Merchant of Venice. Think of Fagin in Oliver Twist. what possessed authors to take that route? Any ideas?
Well, in Shakespeare will, of course, be another person who wouldn't have met who wouldn't have knowingly met a Jewish person. Um, with Dickens, it's very interesting because, of course, he would have. And Dickens, we think of as someone who's a very humane author and is very interested in the structures of underclass life and lack of opportunity. Right? He's a social critic. Actually, Oliver Twist was written in kind of in installments,
Yeah.
and one of his Jewish correspondents actually wrote to him early on and kind of criticized certainly the reference to Fagin as the Jew, often like that, and Dickens took that on board later on in how the work developed. But I think this question about the place of Jews in society is something that was of great interest to many 19th century writers, along with Dickens, with this kind of this East End underclass that he's kind of portraying and using a Jewish stereotype in the form of one of his main characters. There's also the very interesting case of Walter Scott and Walter Scott's Ivanhoe, where the heroine, in a sense, is the Jewess Rebecca, this figure of medieval England. She's, of course, the impossible love match, right? For the hero, it is impossible for them to be together, and yet she's clearly the most sympathetic female lead, and this interest in Jews and this kind of complex philo-Semitism in the 19th century, along with the sense of Jews as different and other, is a very interesting part of the story. I mean, people with different expertise than me would probably, be able to say something intelligent for your listeners about Benjamin Disraeli in this context as well.
Yeah, very much so. Mr. Zoom has warned me that we've got less than 10 minutes left. So can we move on to the Jewish Cultural Studies project? Are you heading this one up?
I am. I'm along with some leaders in the Jewish community and more broadly in the city of Norwich. I'm the lead for Jewish cultural and heritage projects from the University of East Anglia. And this is I'm quite excited to talk about this because it's really an interesting chapter.
Yeah. So what's it all about?
Well, in some ways we have what's it all about? In some ways, what we have in Norwich is a touchstone to this entire story that I've been telling you about today.
Yeah.
A story about Jewish persecution and movements, but also about Jewish life. What this is Jernit's house. That's what we're calling the project, but it's also the name for what we have here, which is the oldest extant building of Jewish habitation in England, which in the early 13th century was inhabited by Isaac Jernit, financier to the Christians, to the crown, and to the church, but also a patron of Jewish learning. And also the object of an early and recognizable anti-Semitic caricature in the Exchequer rolls. This house, or what's left of it, the Undercroft, is a wonderful space, a wonderful Gothic space within a historic building called the Music House. And we endeavor to transform it, to make it the heart of it's something that will be both a center for the study and promotion of Jewish heritage and culture in Norwich, and a study center linked to the University of East Anglia. This is a space we want to make accessible and visible. I use this term touchstone not just because we have the stones, but for a very important reason. These important stones that we have include the door jamb column, so the entrance to the house. And this idea of the doorpost is so important in Judaism. There's the commandment to put these words, to put the words that remind you of the commandments on your doorposts. This is the mezuzah that you often see on Jewish homes, that box with the scroll in it on the door, as a touchstone to remember the commandments, to remember what's happened. And the fact that we are able to locate this on a door column is of immense significance to us.
So are you basing the project at this particular property?
Certainly we want, so we have, there's a few aims in this project. Certainly we want to make that space accessible. The city council has made the music house, has offered to make the music house, the building surrounding it, available to us to be the home of a heritage, cultural, and study center.
Yeah.
This all came about following the Lord Mayor's desire to make an apology for the Blood Libel, which we enacted at a civic Passover Seder that we led at the university. But Jernit's House is also a study program. It's which doesn't all need to take place in that building, and certainly won't while the restoration works are underway. And what we're looking to do now is raise money for an academic director and university posts, so that Jewish studies can establish a foothold in the University of East Anglia. And then as we also start raising funds for the important conservation work to transform this site into both a place of memory, but also a place for heritage and culture, we'll have an institution to house within it. But Jernit's House as the project for which we have the impetus now doesn't require the building, but the building is an essential part of Norwich's heritage, and indeed of this country's heritage. And in some ways, that building allows us to make two key points, which is one on a local level, which is that Jewish heritage is part of Norwich heritage, but on a more significant level, that Norwich and England are part of world Jewish history, and in a way that this country, that Britain in general, has not fully recognized. And I appreciate, there's many stories that are themselves involve sadness, that need to be better treated in this country's history. And then the Channel Islands listeners will appreciate this very strongly from recent discoveries. And I would never put becoming wiser as being in opposition to being happier. I know a lot of people like to say, why talk about sad stories? Let's move on. But becoming wiser, is not a blame game. It's about developing a richer sense of, and indeed sadder in some sense, perspective. But that's a more satisfactory contentedness. I think it will make this a more grounded place.
Very quickly, how long is it going to take, do you think, to conclude the project? Or is it, well, I know it's going to be ongoing, but, when do you expect to sort of have it up and running to the point where people, for example, can visit, et cetera, et cetera?
The first order of business, because the building is in a poor state of repair, the first order of business is a proper survey and then do that kind of conservation work on it. In terms of all that up and running, I would like to say within the next 2 or 3 years, we'll be able to have this place to be visitable to the public. And likewise for the study center, I hope we'll be able to get moving even quicker. So do watch this space, because things have been happening very fast. But we are reliant on we will be reliant in terms of how quickly we're able to move on generosity and the farsightedness of people to realize this as a cultural heritage asset, but also as an opportunity to learn more and the type of things that a university can do, and to work with us on this and to work with the community because it's a small community, a small Jewish community here that has found itself as custodian to something of world historical importance.
Mm. Well, I wish you every success. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today. And, perhaps you'll give us a progress report next year or something like that. Let us know how things are going.
I'd love that, Tony. Thanks for making the time.
And thank you, Oren, very, very much. All the very best. Bye.